Morning arrived without announcement in northern Michigan. No sudden light, no bird song, fanfare, just a slow leak of gray through pine branches, heavy with yesterday's snow. The digital clock on the nightstand read 0447 when Marcus Webb's eyes opened, pupils contracting against the dim room as his hand moved automatically to the pistol beneath his pillow. 3 seconds of listening, wind against weathered siding, the furnace cycling down. Rex's breathing from the foot of the bed, steady and deep. No threat, not today. Marcus sat up, joints protesting quietly, the kind of pain that announced itself every morning like an old acquaintance who refused to leave. 52 years pressing down on a frame that had been built for 30. He swung his legs over the edge, feet finding wool socks without looking, muscle memory guiding him through the dark. Rex lifted his head. The Belgian Malinois was 7 years old, 70 pounds of tan, and black muscle wrapped in a coat meant for winters harder than most dogs ever saw. His amber eyes caught what little light existed, reflecting it back with an intelligence that sometimes made Marcus forget he was working with an animal and not another operator. The scars told their own story. A puckered line ran along Rex's right shoulder where shrapnel had carved its signature during a convoy ambush outside Ramadi. His right hind leg carried a slight hitch, the femur having healed at an angle after the same blast threw him against a Humvee's wheel well. But it was the ears that mattered most. Cropped close in the Belgian tradition, they no longer caught sound the way they should. The IED that had ended Marcus's fourth deployment had stolen 40% of Rex's hearing, leaving the dog with a muffled world and a handler who understood exactly what that meant. Marcus reached for the small case on the nightstand. Inside, nestled in foam cut to precise dimensions, sat the hearing device. Not military issue. The VA had declined that request with the efficiency of bureaucrats who measured worth in spreadsheets rather than service records. This one had cost Marcus 3 months of disability checks and a favor called in from a veterinary neurologist at Michigan State who owed him for something neither man discussed. The device fit behind Rex's left ear, the better one, amplifying frequencies the damaged cochlea could no longer process naturally. Marcus's fingers worked with the careful precision of a man who had once diffused explosives for a living, securing the small unit against fur and skin, checking the indicator light that pulsed green twice before settling into steady operation. Rex's ears shifted forward fractionally. The world had returned, incomplete but functional. They moved through the cabin in synchronized silence. Marcus pulled on thermal layers, the deep charcoal fabric worn soft from years of Minnesota winters. Over that, canvas work pants in faded olive, knees reinforced with patches he had sewn himself, because paying someone else felt like admitting something he was not ready to admit. His hands found a flannel shirt without conscious thought, buttons closing in a rhythm established through repetition rather than planning. The coffee maker gurgled to life, cheap grounds and tap water producing something that tasted more like obligation than pleasure. Marcus poured it into a dented metal thermos that had survived 3 deployments and a divorce, the kind of object that outlasted relationships through simple refusal to break. Rex waited by the door, harness already settled across his chest. Black nylon with a single red stripe along the spine, the kind search and rescue teams used before anyone decided search and rescue was worth funding properly. The dog's posture held no anticipation, no excitement, just readiness. He had learned long ago that mornings meant work, and work meant purpose. And purpose was the only thing that kept the nightmares from bleeding into daylight. Outside, the cold bit with teeth that had been sharpened over thousands of years of practice. Northern Michigan did not ease into winter or out of it. The temperature sat at 19 degrees, the kind of cold that turned breath into visible proof of life and made exposed skin ache within seconds. Marcus inhaled deeply, feeling the freeze coat his lungs, the sharp clarity of it cutting through whatever fog had accumulated during sleep. The cabin sat 2 miles outside Iron Creek proper, far enough that neighbors required intention rather than proximity. The nearest structure belonged to Ruth Calloway, a quarter-mile down a road the county plows sometimes remembered. Her driveway had collected 8 inches overnight, smooth white interrupted only by the tracks of a single deer that had passed through around midnight, judging by the crisp edges of the prints. Marcus grabbed the snow shovel leaning against the porch rail. Rex moved ahead, paws crunching through the crust with the methodical gait of an animal that knew rushing wasted energy. They crossed the distance in silence, boots and paws marking a trail that would disappear by afternoon when the temperature climbed into the low 30s and turned everything to slush. Ruth's house wore its age honestly. White clapboard siding that had been painted last sometime during the Reagan administration, blue shutters faded to a shade that existed somewhere between navy and gray. Smoke curled from the chimney in a thin line that the wind bent horizontal before shredding into nothing. She would be awake. Ruth Calloway had not slept past dawn in the 43 years since her husband failed to come home from what the Army had called a training exercise. Marcus started at the walkway, blades scraping against concrete hidden beneath the snow. The rhythm settled into his bones the way manual labor always did, each motion feeding into the next, creating a pattern that required no thought and therefore permitted plenty. His mind drifted to the box of files sitting unopened on his kitchen table, forwarded from the VA with a note suggesting he consider filing for increased disability compensation due to documented PTSD symptoms. The checkboxes on the form asked questions he did not want to answer. Sleep disturbances, hypervigilance, intrusive memories. The words felt clinical, designed to reduce the weight of 4 deployments into categories that fit neatly on government letterhead. Rex sat at the driveway's edge, amber eyes tracking the tree line across the road. Not alert, observant. There was a difference Marcus had learned to read in the set of the dog's shoulders, the angle of his head. Alert meant threat. Observant meant Rex was doing what he had been trained to do, which was catalog the world's movements and file them away for later consideration. The front door opened halfway through the third pass. Ruth stood framed in warm light, wrapped in a cardigan that had probably been cream-colored once but had faded into something closer to old paper. Her silver hair was pinned in a loose arrangement that suggested she had been awake long enough to care, but not so long she felt the need to impress anyone. 76 years had bent her spine into a gentle curve and written lines around her eyes that spoke of winters survived and summers that never lasted long enough. Her voice carried the particular warmth of someone who had lived alone long enough to treasure any interruption of solitude. "You're up before the sun again." Marcus paused, breath clouding between them. "Snow doesn't check the clock." Ruth smiled, the expression reaching her eyes in a way that made the lines deepen. "I baked bread yesterday. Come by later." He nodded once, the kind of acknowledgement that committed to nothing while accepting everything. "I'll check your furnace too." She waved a hand as if dismissing the offer, but her eyes softened with something that looked like gratitude shaped by years of learning not to ask for help directly. Rex trotted over, lowering his head so Ruth could scratch behind his remaining good ear. She murmured something Marcus could not hear, the words lost in the space between them, but the dog's tail moved once in slow appreciation. For a moment, the tableau held. An old woman, a broken soldier, and a damaged dog finding something that resembled peace in a gesture so small it would disappear the moment anyone tried to name it. Ruth's expression shifted, the warmth pulling back just enough to make room for something heavier. "You heard about Benjamin Aldrich." It was not a question. In towns this small, news traveled faster than weather forecasts and with considerably more accuracy. Marcus finished the last section of walkway before responding. "Saw the obituary. You should go to the funeral." He stacked the snow in a neat pile away from the steps, giving himself time to formulate a response that would not invite follow-up questions. "I didn't know him well." Ruth studied him with the particular intensity of someone who had spent decades learning to read what people did not say. "He talked about you, said you were the only one who came back from that river." The memory rose unbidden. Late March 6 years ago, when winter had refused to release its grip and the ice on Iron Creek had thinned to the point of treachery. Marcus had been walking the shoreline, following Rex on one of the dog's increasingly rare good days, when he heard the crack. Not the sharp report of a gunshot, but the deep groan of frozen water surrendering to physics and poor judgment. Benjamin Aldrich had been trying to cross at a bend where the current ran faster than it should, where ice never formed as thick as it appeared. Marcus had not thought. Training overrode hesitation. He went in after the old man, water temperature somewhere around 34 degrees, cold enough to stop a heart within minutes and freeze muscle function within seconds. Rex had barked from the shore, the sound distant and distorted through damaged hearing, but present enough to anchor Marcus to the idea that getting out mattered. He had pulled Aldrich from the water using a combination of rope, leverage, and the kind of stubbornness that kept EO detects alive long enough to become veterans. The old man had been delirious, hypothermic, skin the color of concrete. His lips had moved around words that made no sense at the time. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. They made me stop looking. Marcus had assumed it was hypothermia talking. The brain did strange things when core temperature dropped below 95 degrees. He had gotten Aldrich to shore, called emergency services, waited until the ambulance arrived, then disappeared before anyone could ask for a statement or thank him properly. Ruth's voice pulled him back to the present. He died 3 days ago. They said cardiac arrest. Marcus finished stacking the shovel against her porch rail. He was 78. His heart was strong. The way she said it carried weight that had nothing to do with medical fact, and everything to do with the kind of knowing that came from living long enough to recognize when official explanations left too many questions unanswered. Marcus looked at Rex. The dog had shifted position, nose pointed toward town, ears angled forward despite the mechanical assistance they required. Something had caught his attention. Not threat level, but interest. A scent carried on wind that had traveled across 3 miles of forest and frozen lake to reach them here. The funeral's tomorrow, Ruth continued. You should go. He knew deflection would not work. Ruth Calloway had been a teacher for 37 years before retirement, and teachers developed immunity to evasion the way doctors developed immunity to sympathy. I'll think about it. She accepted the non-answer with the grace of someone who understood that some men needed to arrive at decisions through their own circuitous routes. He would have wanted you there. Whatever he was carrying, you gave him 6 more years to carry it. Marcus turned to leave, but Ruth's next words stopped him. When Peter died, Ben came to see me. This was 2003. Lung cancer took Pete after 40 years of growing in his chest like something planted. Ben asked if Pete ever mentioned chemical exposure. I said no, but Pete had nightmares. About barrels. Lots of barrels. The detail landed with more weight than it should have. Marcus filed it away in the compartment where he stored information that did not make immediate sense but might later. The same mental discipline that had kept him alive when wires were color-coded incorrectly and manuals were written by people who had never seen an actual IED. He nodded to Ruth, called Rex to heel, and walked back toward the cabin as the sun finally crested the tree line, turning snow into something that hurt to look at directly. The rest of the morning passed in the kind of routine that Marcus had built carefully over the 3 years since separating from the Army. Routine was structure, and structure was the only thing standing between functional veteran and the kind of statistics that showed up in a suicide reports. He split wood behind the cabin, each swing of the maul driving the blade through seasoned oak with a sound that echoed off the surrounding pines. Rex watched from the porch, head resting on crossed paws, conserving energy the way working dogs learn to do. Lunch was instant oatmeal and black coffee, consumed standing at the kitchen counter while reading through a manual on electrical wiring that he had ordered from a website specializing in homestead self-sufficiency. The cabin needed rewiring in the east bedroom, and paying an electrician felt like admitting he could not do it himself. The manual made it seem simple. Color-coded wires, basic principles of current flow, safety protocols that assumed the reader possessed common sense, and a healthy respect for voltages that could stop a human heart as efficiently as any bullet. The knock came at 13:47, precise enough that Marcus knew who it was before opening the door. Hank Reston did not believe in approximate time. 71 years old, built like a man who had spent his youth lifting engine blocks, and his middle age refusing to admit that engine blocks had gotten heavier. His hair had gone the color of steel wool, cropped close to his skull, in a cut that suggested military service, the way certain scars suggested stories better left untold. Vietnam, 1969 through 1971. Army mechanized infantry, wounded twice, decorated once, disillusioned permanently. Hank stood on the porch in a canvas jacket that was likely older than Marcus, hands shoved in pockets against the cold. Aldrich is dead. Marcus stepped aside to let him enter. Rex lifted his head in acknowledgement but did not rise. Hank had earned the dog's trust years ago through the simple expedient of never trying to force interaction and always bringing dog treats that were expensive enough to matter. I heard. Hank moved to the wood stove, holding his hands toward the heat without getting close enough to crowd it. You going to the funeral? Haven't decided. You should. Marcus poured coffee into 2 mugs, both chipped, both functional. He handed one to Hank and waited. Developers have been circling that property for years, Hank said, his voice carrying the particular roughness of someone who had breathed too much diesel exhaust and Agent Orange residue. Aldrich fought them every time. Now he's dead? Convenient. You think someone killed a 78-year-old man for real estate? Hank's expression suggested the question was either naive or rhetorical. I think people kill for less, and I think Aldrich knew something that made him worth more dead than alive. Marcus sipped his coffee, considering. The world Hank described was not the one Marcus wanted to believe in, but it was closer to the one he had experienced than any version involving coincidence and natural causes. What did he know? That's the question. They stood in silence, drinking coffee that had gone lukewarm, while outside the wind picked up and began rearranging the snow into patterns that would look random to anyone who did not understand fluid dynamics. Hank set his mug down with the deliberate care of a man making a decision. The funeral's tomorrow at 11. St. Catherine's. I'm driving Frank. Frank Dumont, 80 years old, Korean War veteran, mind slipping in and out of the present like a radio station losing signal. He lived in a care facility on the south side of town, the kind of place that smelled like industrial cleaner and regret. Most days Frank thought it was 1952. Some days he thought it was yesterday. Occasionally, usually without warning, he would surface into clarity and say things that suggested his mind had been storing information all along, just filing it in drawers no one could open reliably. Frank knew Aldrich? Everyone knew Aldrich. He's been in this town since 1975. But sometimes Frank says things about 1968, about trucks and barrels and dirt that smelled wrong. Marcus felt the first pull of something he had learned not to trust. Curiosity. It had gotten him into explosive ordnance disposal in the first place. The desire to understand how things worked and why they failed. It had nearly gotten him killed more times than his service record officially acknowledged. I'll drive myself. Hank nodded as if the answer had been predetermined. Wear your dress uniform. Aldrich was Army. After Hank left, Marcus stood at the window and watched the afternoon light begin its early retreat. Winter days in northern Michigan lasted about as long as good intentions, fading into darkness by 1700 and leaving nothing but cold in the memory of what warmth felt like. Rex appeared beside him, pressing his shoulder against Marcus's leg in the way he did when he sensed unease. The contact was slight but specific, a reminder that presence mattered even when words failed. Marcus reached down and ran his hand along the dog's head, fingers finding the small device behind the ear and checking its position out of habit rather than need. We gonna regret this? Rex's tail moved once. Not agreement, just acknowledgement that the question had been asked. The dress uniform came out of the closet still wrapped in the plastic it had been placed in 3 years ago. The day Marcus had signed his separation papers and walked out of Fort Bragg with a duffel bag and a service record that read like fiction. Army combat uniform in digital camouflage. The pattern designed to blend into environments Marcus no longer inhabited. The unit patch on the left shoulder marked him as 52nd Ordnance Group, EOD. The right shoulder carried the combat patch from a 3rd Infantry Division, evidence of a deployment that had ended with an explosion that took 2 lives and most of Rex's hearing. He laid it on the bed and considered whether wearing it was honoring the past or hiding in it. The next morning arrived with the kind of cold that made breathing painful and starting engines a negotiation between battery power and ambient temperature. Marcus's truck turned over on the 3rd attempt, diesel engine coughing into reluctant life, black smoke curling from the exhaust before thinning to translucent gray. Rex climbed into the passenger seat, settling onto a blanket that had been placed there specifically for him, nose immediately going to the heating vent as warm air began its slow circulation. St. Catherine's sat on the north edge of town, a stone structure built in 1887 by Finnish immigrants who understood that churches needed to withstand winters that could break lesser buildings. The parking lot held maybe 30 vehicles, which for Iron Creek constituted a significant turnout. Marcus parked at the far edge, muscle memory placing him in a position with clear exit routes and maximum visibility of approaching vehicles. The uniform felt foreign, too clean, too formal, like wearing someone else's skin and hoping nobody noticed the fit was wrong. He adjusted the garrison cap, checked the ribbons aligned properly across his chest, and stepped out into cold that went through wool as if searching for bone. Inside, the church smelled of old wood and failing heating systems. Pews held scattered mourners, most of them elderly, all of them wearing expressions that suggested attending funerals, had become a regular feature of their social calendar. Ruth sat in the 3rd row, flanked by 2 women Marcus did not recognize. Hank occupied a seat near the back, Frank beside him, the old man's eyes distant and unfocused. The casket sat closed at the altar, simple pine construction that matched the church's utilitarian aesthetic. No flowers, no photographs. Just a flag folded into the triangle that every military family learned to recognize and most learned to dread. Marcus found a seat in the last pew, Rex settling at his feet in the way service dogs learn to occupy space without announcing themselves. The dog's breathing was quiet, measured, the hearing device's indicator light pulsing its steady green confirmation that the world was being processed, incomplete but functional. The service was brief. A priest who looked young enough to be someone's grandson read from scripture with the practiced efficiency of a man who performed this ritual often enough that genuine emotion had been replaced by professional competence. A single speaker stood, Mayor Thomas Weatherly, 63, balding, wearing a suit that suggested he owned exactly one and saved it for occasions that required looking important. His voice carried the particular timbre of small-town politics, smooth enough to be pleasant and empty enough to mean nothing. Benjamin Aldrich served this community for nearly 50 years. As a veteran, as a citizen, as a voice for those who felt unheard, he will be missed. The words landed without weight. Marcus had heard similar eulogies over flag-draped coffins in ceremonies that happened in hangars and chapels scattered across 2 decades of continuous deployment. The phrases were interchangeable: served with honor, made the ultimate sacrifice, will be remembered. What they meant was, here is another body, process it efficiently, move to the next. The priest concluded with a prayer Marcus did not follow, his mind instead cataloging details. The closed casket, the lack of family, the way the mayor's eyes had flicked to someone in the second row when he mentioned Aldrich being a voice for the unheard. Marcus turned his head slightly, following the sightline. 3 people sat together, too well dressed for Iron Creek, too carefully postured to be locals. The man in the center was maybe 58, gray at the temples, jaw that looked like it had been designed by committee to project authority without aggression. He wore a dark suit that probably cost more than Marcus's truck, and sat with the kind of posture that suggested military service lay somewhere in his past. The woman to his left was younger, maybe 42, auburn hair pulled back in a style that was professional without being severe. Her eyes moved across the church with the systematic efficiency of someone conducting surveillance while maintaining plausible deniability. The man to the right was built differently. Broader shoulders, thicker hands, hair cropped close enough to show scalp. He sat with a stillness that Marcus recognized immediately. Not relaxation, controlled tension, the kind of readiness that came from training that had been drilled deep enough to become reflex. Rex shifted position, ears angling toward the second row. Not alert, interested. The dog's nose lifted fractionally, processing air currents and whatever information they carried. The service ended. People filed out in the shuffling silence of a crowd that knew the appropriate responses without needing to think about them. Marcus waited, letting others clear, watching the 3 strangers through peripheral vision that had been trained to track threats without appearing to look directly at them. They were the last to stand. The older man paused at the casket, placed a hand on the wood in a gesture that could have been respect or ownership, then turned toward the door. His eyes found Marcus with the inevitability of someone who had noticed the uniformed veteran in the back row and filed him away for later attention. Outside, the cold had intensified, temperature hovering around 12 degrees, wind adding subtraction that pushed effective temperature into single digits. Marcus moved to his truck, Rex at heel, both of them crossing the parking lot with the purposeful stride of individuals who understood that standing still meant freezing. "Mr. Webb?" The voice came from behind, smooth and confident, the kind of voice that expected to be listened to because it always had been. Marcus turned. The older man from the second row stood 3 feet away, hands in the pockets of his expensive coat, breath clouding between them. "You knew Ben, not a question." Marcus said nothing, waiting the way EOD techs learned to wait, because rushing was how people died and patience was how puzzles revealed themselves. The man extended a hand. "David Crane, I'm handling the estate." Marcus took the hand because refusing would have signaled something he was not ready to signal. The grip was firm without being aggressive, practiced without being performative. Military somewhere in the background. Officer probably, the kind who gave orders and expected them followed. "Handling it how?" Crane smiled, the expression calculated to project warmth without committing to genuine emotion. "Ben named you in his will. There's a reading scheduled for tomorrow afternoon at the property, 2 o'clock. Margaret Hayes is the attorney. She'll have the details." Marcus felt Rex press against his leg, slight pressure that meant the dog had noticed something worth noticing. Not threat, interest. Why me? Crane's smile held. That's what we're all wondering. The woman from the second row appeared beside Crane, moving with the efficient grace of someone who measured distance in tactical units rather than casual steps. Up close, Marcus could see the intelligence in her eyes, the way she was cataloging him the same way he was cataloging her. Rachel Voss, she said, offering no hand, legal counsel for Crane Development. Development of what? Opportunity, Crane interjected smoothly. Ben's property has significant value. The right development could bring jobs to this area. Real jobs. 200 units marina, resort amenities. We're talking $50 million in investment. Marcus glanced at the church, at the flag-draped casket visible through the open doors. Man's not even buried yet. Crane's expression shifted fractionally, something harder showing beneath the smooth surface. Progress doesn't stop for sentiment, Mr. Webb. Ben understood that. I hope you will too. The third man had drifted closer, positioning himself at an angle that was not quite flanking, but was definitely not casual. Marcus registered the placement, filed it, said nothing. I'll be there tomorrow, Marcus said. 2 o'clock. Crane nodded as if the answer had been predetermined. Good. We have a lot to discuss. He turned to leave, Rachel Voss following, but the third man remained, eyes locked on Marcus with an intensity that carried recognition. EOD, right? His voice was rough, shaped by years of shouting over gunfire and machinery. Iraq, 2004 through 2008? Marcus said nothing. Force Recon, Thomas Kern, Ramadi 06. The name meant nothing. The timeline did. Marcus had been in Ramadi in 2006, pulling IEDs out of roads while Marines provided security. Same war, different jobs, same outcome. Everyone went home damaged or didn't go home at all. You work for Crane? Security consultant, which meant hired muscle with a resume and business cards. Marcus had met the type before, good soldiers who came home to discover the skills that made them valuable in combat zones, made them unemployable in any environment that cared about collateral damage. Kern's expression shifted, something almost apologetic entering it. Be careful, Webb. Crane's a believer, and true believers are the most dangerous people on earth. He walked away before Marcus could respond, leaving nothing but cold air and the sound of expensive vehicles starting in sequence. Rex remained pressed against Marcus's leg, solid and present. The dog's eyes tracked the departing vehicles with interest that bordered on intensity, and when Marcus moved toward his truck, Rex hesitated. Not disobedience. Consideration. What is it? Rex's nose lifted, testing air that had already carried the stranger's scent away. Whatever the dog was processing, it was being filed in categories Marcus could not access, stored in a consciousness that operated on frequencies human understanding could not reach. They climbed into the truck. The engine turned over, heat beginning its slow infiltration. Marcus sat for a moment, hands on the wheel, watching the church in the rearview mirror. Ruth emerged, supported by the 2 women Marcus did not recognize. She looked smaller than she had yesterday, as if the funeral had taken something from her that could not be replaced. Hank followed, guiding Frank with the careful attention of someone managing delicate cargo. Frank's eyes were unfocused, lost somewhere in a time that existed only in neural pathways that no longer connected reliably. Marcus put the truck in gear and pulled out of the parking lot, pointing it toward the cabin in the kind of solitude that felt less like peace and more like postponement. The Aldrich property sat where Iron Creek widened before feeding into the strait, positioned on a rise that gave it clear sight lines across water that was currently frozen into ridged white, interrupted by patches where current ran fast enough to prevent solidification. The main structure was built from timber that had been harvested when logging meant axes and crosscut saws, thick beams notched together with the kind of joinery that predated power tools and planned obsolescence. 2 stories, wide porch facing the water, windows that were original glass, wavy and imperfect, distorting the view in ways that made distances uncertain. A detached workshop sat 50 yards to the east, smaller but built with the same attention to permanence. Between the buildings, snow had drifted into shapes that suggested no one had cleared paths in weeks. Marcus arrived 15 minutes early, habit placing him in position to observe before being observed. Rex sat in the passenger seat, nose pressed to the window, breath fogging glass that cleared each time the dog pulled back to reassess. A black sedan was already parked near the main entrance, German manufacturer, current model year. The kind of vehicle that cost enough to make a statement without being vulgar about it. Margaret Hayes stood beside it, 72 years old, silver hair cut in a style that was practical without surrendering to age. She wore a long wool coat and sensible boots, dressed for northern Michigan winter rather than legal proceedings. Marcus parked beside her. Rex waited for the door to open before jumping down, landing with a slight hitch in his right rear leg that cold weather always emphasized. Margaret approached with the direct efficiency of someone who measured time in billable hours and did not waste either. "Mr. Webb, thank you for coming." Her handshake was firm, brief, professional. She glanced at Rex with the expression of someone who appreciated dogs without needing to interact with them. "He's service animal?" "Retired, but yes." She nodded, accepting the information without requiring elaboration. "The others will be here shortly. The reading is straightforward." Ben was very specific about his wishes. Crane said something about development. Margaret's expression remained neutral, the kind of carefully maintained blankness that attorneys cultivated when they had opinions that were legally inadvisable to express. "Mr. Crane has expressed interest in the property. However, ownership transfer must occur before any such discussions are relevant." Two more vehicles appeared on the access road. The first was Crane's sedan, sleek and dark and expensive. The second was a heavy-duty pickup, black, equipped with off-road suspension and auxiliary lighting that suggested the driver expected to travel places roads did not reach. Crane emerged from the sedan, followed by Rachel Voss. Both wore clothing that split the difference between professional and practical, suits made from materials designed to repel weather without looking like outdoor gear. Thomas Kern stepped out of the pickup, moving with the controlled economy of someone whose body had learned that unnecessary motion was wasted energy. Rex's ears pivoted forward, tracking Kern's approach with interest that made Marcus's hand drop instinctively to the dog's harness. Not restraint, connection, a reminder that they operated as unit, not individuals. Margaret unlocked his main door, the deadbolt turning with resistance that suggested infrequent use. Inside smelled of closed spaces and time passing without intervention. Wood smoke residue from fires burned years ago. Dust settled into layers that mark seasons. The faint chemical tang of something Marcus's brain cataloged as familiar but could not immediately identify. The main room held furniture arranged for function rather than aesthetics. Heavy chairs, a table large enough to suggest meals shared by groups. Bookshelves lined one wall, spines faded but organized with the precision of someone who believed systems mattered. A fireplace dominated the far wall, stone blackened by decades of use. Rex moved through the space methodically, nose low, processing information in whatever way working dogs process the accumulated scent signature of lives lived and ended. He paused at the fireplace, interest sharpening, then continued his circuit. Margaret set her briefcase on the table and withdrew a folder, thick enough to suggest complexity or complications. Possibly both. "Please sit." Crane took the chair at the head of the table, positioning himself with the casual authority of someone who assumed leadership without requesting it. Rachel sat to his right. Kern remained standing, positioned near the window with clear view of both the room and the approach road. Marcus took the chair opposite Crane, Rex settling at his feet in the space beneath the table where the dog could remain present without being obvious. Margaret opened the folder, papers rustling with the specific sound of legal documents printed on expensive stock. Benjamin Aldrich's will is straightforward. The bulk of his estate, consisting of this property and the 47 acres surrounding it, is bequeathed to Marcus Webb. The words landed in silence that stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Crane's expression did not change, but something tightened around his eyes. Rachel's pen stopped moving across her notepad. Kern shifted weight fractionally, the movement so slight it was almost subliminal. Marcus said nothing, waiting. Margaret continued. Additionally, Mr. Aldrich left specific items. She withdrew a keyring from the folder. 3 keys, 1 modern deadbolt, 1 older skeleton key, 1 small brass key that looked like it belonged to a padlock or locker. These unlocked the property, the workshop, and a footlocker currently in the master bedroom upstairs. She placed them on the table between herself and Marcus. The metal made a small sound against wood. There is also this. From her pocket, she produced a silver coin, larger than a modern dollar, worn smooth at the edges from handling or age. The silver caught light from the window and held it, reflecting it back as something harder than mere metal should manage. Marcus picked it up, heavy. Real silver, not plated. He turned it, examining both sides. The obverse showed Liberty facing left, her hair bound in a coronet, the date stamped below, 1968. The reverse displayed an eagle with wings spread, arrows clutched in one talon, olive branch in the other. Between the eagle's tail feathers and the edge of the coin, someone had engraved something. Marcus tilted it toward the light. Covenant. The letters were small, precise, cut with the kind of attention that suggested the word mattered beyond decoration. Beneath the table, Rex's body went still. Not the stillness of rest, the stillness of focus. Marcus felt it through the contact where the dog's shoulder pressed against his calf, the way he had learned to feel changes in tension that preceded alerts. What's the covenant? Margaret's expression suggested the question had been anticipated, and the answer was complicated. I don't know. Ben never explained. He simply specified that the coin be given to you along with the property. Crane leaned forward, hands flat on the table, voice still smooth but carrying new undercurrent. Mr. Webb, I respect what you did for Ben. Pulling him from the creek was heroic, but this property has value beyond sentiment. Real value. Jobs for this community. Economic development that could revitalize an area that's been dying for 20 years. Marcus rotated the coin between his fingers, feeling the weight of it, the texture where the engraving interrupted smooth metal. You're offering to buy $1.8 million. You keep your cabin. We develop the waterfront. Everyone benefits. Rachel added numbers to the equation with the precision of someone whose job was quantifying everything. Property taxes on this land are $47,000 per year. Maintenance, utilities, insurance. You're looking at $90,000 minimum annual overhead. Can you afford that? Marcus set the coin on the table, the sound of silver against wood cutting through Rachel's calculation. I'll think about it. Crane's smile held, but something behind it had calcified. Think quickly. We file for eminent domain in 1 week. Public interest, economic development zone. The county commissioners are very interested in creating jobs. Ben fought you for years. Ben was stuck in this past, holding on to something that doesn't exist anymore. Crane stood, the motion smooth and final. You have 7 days, Mr. Webb. After that, the decision gets made whether you like it or not. Rachel gathered her materials with efficient movements, each paper returning to its designated slot in her briefcase. Kern remained by the window, eyes on Marcus with an intensity that felt like communication without words. They left in formation, Crane first projecting confidence, Rachel second, projecting competence. Kern last, projecting something that looked almost like regret. When the engine started and the vehicles pulled away, silence returned with weight that pressed against the walls. Margaret closed her folder, organizing papers with the methodical care of someone who believed proper filing prevented future chaos. The property is legally yours. Deed will be recorded by end of week. What you do with it after that is your decision. Marcus looked at the coin again. Silver catching light. One word engraved where it would be missed unless specifically searched for. Did you know Aldrich well? Margaret paused, considering how much truth the question required. I handled his affairs for 15 years. He was methodical, sometimes obsessive. He kept files on everything. Newspaper clippings, military records, soil samples in sealed bags. She met Marcus's eyes. Whatever he left you, it mattered to him more than anything else in his life. After she left, Marcus sat alone in the quiet building, Rex emerging from beneath the table to resume his inspection. The dog moved to the fireplace again, nose working over stone that had been heated and cooled thousands of times, absorbing decades of smoke and whatever else had been burned there. Marcus climbed the stairs, each step groaning under weight it had supported since before he was born. The master bedroom was sparse, single bed with military corners on a wool blanket, nightstand holding a lamp and nothing else. Dresser with 3 framed photographs Marcus did not examine closely. The footlocker sat at the foot of the bed. Military surplus from an era when military surplus meant steel construction and locks that required keys rather than combinations. The small brass key fit perfectly, turning with resistance that suggested long disuse. Inside, organized with the precision of someone who understood that information had value only if it could be retrieved efficiently. A leather journal, cover worn smooth, pages filled with handwriting that was small and controlled. A manila folder stamped with red letters, closed. Training accident. 3 photographs, black and white, showing young men in uniforms that dated to the late 1960s. Their names were written on the back in the same controlled handwriting that filled the journal. Private First Class James Whitmore, Corporal Samuel Hayes, Sergeant Peter Calloway. Ruth's husband. A sealed plastic bag containing what appeared to be soil. Brown dirt mixed with something darker, almost black. A label affixed to the bag showed a date, November 1971. A map of the property, hand-drawn, with several locations marked with red X symbols. And beneath everything, a letter. Single page. Addressed to whoever finds this in letters that suggested the writer's hand had been unsteady. Marcus unfolded it carefully, paper crackling with age. The handwriting was the same as the journal, but less controlled, as if written in haste or under stress. He read it standing, while outside the light began its early winter retreat, and Rex continued his methodical catalog of a space that held more questions than any room should contain. The letter's first line made everything else irrelevant. If you're reading this, I'm dead. Probably not natural causes. The letter trembled slightly in Marcus's hands. Not from weakness, but from the way paper aged beyond flexibility responded to being unfolded after years of compression. Aldrich's handwriting filled the page, each line sloping slightly downward as if the words themselves carried weight that pulled them toward the bottom edge. If you're reading this, I'm dead. Probably not natural causes. I'm 78, but my heart is strong. Don't believe cardiac arrest. In 1968, I was Army Intelligence, Fort McCoy, Wisconsin. Harlan Chemical Company had a contract to dispose of defoliant chemicals left over from field testing. Agent Orange variants, compounds that were too toxic even for Southeast Asia. I was assigned to verify proper disposal protocols. What I found, they were dumping on what they claimed was federal land. It wasn't. It was unceded native treaty territory, legally protected, but far enough from oversight that nobody checked paperwork too carefully. 3 enlisted men were ordered to dig the burial trenches. Private First Class James Whitmore, 20 years old, from Ohio. Corporal Samuel Hayes, 22, from Pennsylvania. Sergeant Peter Calloway, 24, married 3 months, from right here in Iron Creek. They came to me, scared, told me the barrels were leaking, told me the dirt smelled wrong and made their skin burn. They wanted to report it through proper channels. I said I'd investigate. I was naive enough to believe the chain of command worked the way they taught us it should. 2 days later, all 3 were dead. Training accident, the report said. Live fire exercise gone wrong. I saw their bodies. The wounds didn't match the story. Wrong caliber, wrong angles. But I was 26 and stupid enough to think asking questions would lead to answers instead of threats. My investigation was shut down within a week. A colonel I'd never met called me into his office and explained reality with the patience of a man who had explained it before. National security, contractor relationships. The bigger picture. If I pursued this, I'd be court-martialed for insubordination, and my family would lose my pension. I had a wife, a daughter on the way. I made the choice that cowards make. I stopped asking questions. But I made a promise to those boys' families. Told them I'd find proof someday, that I wouldn't let their sons' deaths mean nothing. I spent 55 years trying to keep that promise, collected soil samples that showed contamination 40 times safe levels, documented the cancer cluster in Iron Creek, 12 people dead from the same aggressive lung cancers between 1998 and 2023. All lived near the water. All drank from wells that pulled groundwater from aquifers fed by runoff from this property. I was blocked at every level. County officials who suddenly had new trucks. State environmental agents who lost my samples in processing. Federal investigators who retired early with comfortable pensions. The covenant was never about the land. It was about standing up when everyone else sits down. About keeping promises to dead soldiers even when the living try to bury them a second time. You pulled me from that creek when I had decided drowning was easier than failing again. You gave me 6 more years to gather proof. Now it's yours. The barrels are still there, 6 feet down. Map shows locations. Rex will find them. Dogs don't forget what chemicals smell like, even through soil and time. When they come for you, and they will come, remember, some missions don't end with extraction. Some require you to hold ground until the truth can't be buried anymore. Benjamin Aldrich, Major, U.S. Army Intelligence, retired. P.S. The silver dollar belonged to Peter Calloway. His wife Ruth gave it to him before deployment. He gave it to me the night before he died, asked me to return it if something happened. I kept it 55 years, waiting to fulfill the promise. Now you carry it. The covenant isn't about revenge. It's about ensuring no one else suffers what they did. Marcus read it twice, the second time slower, absorbing details that the first pass had blurred. When he finished, he folded the paper with the same careful precision Aldrich had used, muscle memory from handling sensitive materials translating across contexts. Rex sat near the window, silhouette dark against fading afternoon light. The dog's ears were forward, body oriented towards something outside that Marcus could not yet perceive. Not threat posture, interest. Marcus descended the stairs, journal and folder tucked under one arm, map folded and placed in his jacket pocket, where it would stay dry and accessible. The property deed sat on the kitchen counter where Margaret had left it, legal language transforming 47 acres into his responsibility, whether he wanted it or not. He spread the map across the table, anchoring corners with objects that came to hand. Coffee mug, flashlight, the silver dollar that had belonged to Peter Calloway and now belonged to the Covenant itself. The hand-drawn map showed the property boundaries in precise detail. Elevation changes marked with contour lines. Water sources indicated with blue ink. 3 red X marks interrupted the topography. One near the eastern boundary where forest thickened. One closer to the shoreline where the land sloped toward frozen water. One directly beneath where the workshop now stood. Marcus traced the lines with his finger, calculating distances, considering approach routes. The eastern mark sat roughly 2 miles from the main building, accessible by an old logging road that appeared on the map but might not exist anymore after 50 years of seasonal erosion. The shoreline mark was closer but exposed, visible from multiple angles, vulnerable to observation. The workshop mark was the most concerning. If barrels were buried beneath an existing structure, excavation would require demolition, and demolition would be noticed. Rex's low bark pulled Marcus from calculation. Not alarm, announcement. Someone was approaching. Through the window, Marcus watched Hank's truck navigate the access road, diesel engine growling against the grade. The vehicle stopped near the porch, and Hank emerged, followed by Frank Dumont, the older man moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose balance had become theoretical rather than guaranteed. Marcus opened the door before they reached it. Cold air poured in, carrying the scent of pine and diesel exhaust. Hank guided Frank inside, one hand under the old man's elbow, the kind of support that maintained dignity while preventing falls. "We need to talk." Frank's eyes found Marcus, clarity surfacing in their watery blue depths, with the unpredictability of sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "I drove the truck." His voice was thin but steady, words shaped by certainty rather than confusion. 1968, November. "They told us it was agricultural chemicals, fertilizer for reforestation projects, but the barrels weren't marked right. No hazard labels, just numbers that didn't match any inventory I'd ever seen." Marcus pulled out a chair. Frank sat with the gratitude of someone whose legs had begun suggesting that standing was negotiable. "How many barrels?" 53. I counted. When you're driving something, you count. In case there's an accident, you need to know what's spilled. Hank leaned against the counter, arms crossed, expression carved from the same stone as his suspicion. "Frank remembered this morning, clear as 40 years ago. Told the nurse he needed to find you." Frank's hands shook slightly, resting on the table surface, age spots mapping decades of sun exposure and manual labor. "Peter was there. Calloway. We were friends before I knew he'd marry Ruth. He pulled me aside after the 3rd load. Said the dirt where we dug burned his hands through work gloves. Said the smell made him dizzy. He was going to report it." "To Aldrich." Frank nodded, the motion slow but definite. "Ben said he'd handle it. Said we should keep quiet until he investigated. 2 days later, Peter was dead. Sam Hayes and Jimmy Whitmore, too. I knew then. Knew it wasn't training accident. But I was 20 years old and scared, and I had people depending on me to not disappear into military prison." The clarity was already fading, Frank's eyes losing focus as whatever neural pathways had aligned shifted back into disorder. "I'm sorry," he whispered, to the room or the past or the men who had died while he had survived by staying silent. Marcus placed his hand over Frank's, contact brief but deliberate. "You're telling it now." After Hank drove Frank back to the care facility, Marcus stood in the empty building and felt the weight of inherited obligations settle across his shoulders with the inevitability of weather. The smart choice was obvious. Take Crane's money. Walk away from land that carried 55 years of poison, both chemical and moral. Let someone else fight battles that predated his involvement. Rex appeared beside him, pressing shoulder against leg in the silent communication that had replaced words years ago. "We're not taking the money, are we?" The dog's tail moved once. Agreement or acknowledgement, the distinction didn't matter. Marcus locked the building and drove back to his cabin as darkness completed its early winter arrival. The temperature had dropped to 7 degrees, cold enough that the truck's heater struggled to maintain anything approaching comfort. Rex sat in the passenger seat, breath fogging the window in rhythmic clouds that appeared and vanished with each exhalation. The next morning arrived with the particular cruelty of Michigan winter. Temperature bottoming out at -4 degrees, wind adding subtraction that pushed effective cold into ranges where exposed skin froze in minutes and metal became dangerous to touch without gloves. Marcus started the truck with the same ritual that had worked through 3 northern winters, battery protesting before surrendering to the inevitable and cranking the engine into reluctant life. The plan was simple. Hike to the eastern X mark, use the ground-penetrating radar Hank had loaned him, confirm what Aldrich's letter claimed, document everything, then decide whether documentation mattered enough to justify the war that would follow. Rex rode in silence, harness secured, heating vent directed toward his position. The dog's ears were forward, tracking sounds that Marcus would never hear. The hearing device pulsing its green confirmation that the world was being processed, even if incompletely. They reached the Aldrich property at 0812, sun barely clearing the tree line, light angling across snow in ways that made depth perception unreliable. Marcus parked near the workshop and unloaded the equipment. Ground-penetrating radar unit that weighed 40 pounds and looked like it had survived several wars of its own. Handheld GPS loaded with coordinates transcribed from Aldrich's map. Soil sample kit in case radar showed anomalies worth investigating. The hike took 37 minutes, breaking trail through snow that varied from ankle-deep powder to knee-deep drifts depending on wind patterns and underlying terrain. Rex ranged ahead, moving with the efficient lope of a working dog conserving energy while covering ground. His nose swept side to side, cataloging scent signatures that included deer tracks from last night, fox marking from 3 days ago, and something else that made him pause and test the air with focused intensity. Marcus watched the behavior, recognizing the shift from casual interest to trained detection. Rex had found something. The GPS indicated they were within 15 feet of the first X mark. Marcus activated the ground-penetrating radar, watching the display screen build an image of subsurface density variations. Nothing for the first 2 passes. Frozen soil, rock formations, tree roots spreading like neural networks beneath the surface. Third pass, the screen showed something different. Regular shapes. Too regular. Cylindrical objects arranged in rough grid pattern, buried approximately 6 feet below current ground level. Marcus photographed the screen, hands steady despite cold that made fingers ache inside insulated gloves. He moved the radar unit in expanding circles, mapping the burial site's full extent. 12 cylindrical objects, each roughly 3 feet tall, 2 feet in diameter. Spacing suggested they had been placed with care rather than dumped randomly. Rex sat 20 feet away, watching with the intensity that meant the dog was processing information through senses Marcus could not access. The Belgian Malinois suddenly stood, moved to a specific spot within the mapped area, and began scratching at the snow. Not digging, indicating. Marcus knelt beside him, brushed away surface snow, found soil beneath that was darker than surrounding earth. He opened the sample kit, used the provided trowel to collect material from 6 inches down, sealed it in a labeled bag. The soil felt wrong, too loose, too rich, as if something had broken down organic material into component parts that included compound soil was never meant to contain. A sound cut through winter silence, engine noise, vehicle approaching on the access road. Marcus's hand dropped to his waist where a holster would have been if he was still the kind of person who carried daily. The truck appeared through trees, black, heavy-duty, the same one Thomas Kern had driven to Aldrich's funeral. It stopped 30 yards away, engine idling, exhaust cloud rising in the cold air. Kern emerged slowly, hands visible, moving with the deliberate caution of someone who understood that sudden movements near veterans could trigger responses that were difficult to reverse. "Mr. Webb?" Marcus said nothing, calculating distances, escape routes, whether Rex could outrun a man Kern's age in snow this deep. "I was hoping you wouldn't find those." "You knew." Kern stopped 10 feet away, far enough to be non-threatening, close enough for conversation that didn't require shouting. "Crane ordered survey work last year. We found the contamination. High enough to trigger federal investigation if reported. He decided to bury it deeper, figuratively and literally. And you went along." Kern's expression suggested the accusation landed accurately but without surprise. My daughter's 12. Leukemia. Treatment runs $43,000 per month. Insurance covers 60%. Crane pays my salary, covers the gap. You want to judge that choice? Go ahead. But make it after you've watched your kid get sicker while you can't afford to help. Marcus felt the weight of the statement, the moral complexity that made simple answers feel childish. Those were soldiers, like us. They're dead. We're alive. Which matters more? The question hung between them, unanswerable in any way that satisfied all variables. Kern glanced at the ground-penetrating radar unit, at Rex still sitting in indication posture, at the soil sample bag Marcus had left exposed. You can't win this. Crane employs 60 people in this county, owns the bank, sits on the planning commission. The judge who signs warrants plays golf with him twice a month. You file reports, they'll disappear. You talk to press, they'll paint you as an unstable vet with agenda. You push hard enough, things happen. Accidents, break-ins, you understand me? Marcus understood perfectly. It was the same understanding that had gotten 3 young soldiers killed in 1968 when they threatened to expose inconvenient truths. I'm asking you. Kern's voice lost its edge, replaced by something closer to pleading. Walk away. Take Crane's money. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Marcus looked at Rex. The dog was watching Kern with an intensity that suggested evaluation rather than threat assessment. Reading, judging, coming to conclusions that would influence Marcus's own. I can't. Kern's shoulders dropped fractionally. Disappointment mixed with resignation. Then be careful, because the next person Crane sends won't be asking. He returned to his truck, engine noise fading as distance and trees absorbed it. Marcus stood in the cold until silence returned, complete and heavy. The soil sample went into an evidence bag. The GPS coordinates were logged. The photographs were backed up to cloud storage using cellular signal that was weak but functional. Then Marcus and Rex hiked back to the truck, neither acknowledging the line that had just been crossed or the consequences that would follow crossing it. The harassment began 3 days later with the subtlety of a surgical strike and the efficiency of military planning. The property tax bill arrived first, delivered by courier rather than mail, the envelope thick enough to suggest complexity. Marcus opened it standing at the kitchen counter, morning coffee still hot in its mug. Assessment had been recalculated. The Aldrich property, previously valued at $412,000, was now listed at $2.6 million. Corresponding tax bill, $94,700. Due in 30 days. Retroactive adjustments for previous 3 years added another $68,000. Marcus called the county assessor's office. Automated system, press 1-4, press 2-4. Eventually a human voice that sounded bored and overworked. The reassessment is based on comparable waterfront properties and development potential. Development potential for land I just inherited? Tax code allows for highest and best use valuation regardless of current use. Who requested the reassessment? That information isn't public record. The call ended with the kind of bureaucratic finality that made argument pointless. The bank called that afternoon. Marcus's checking account had been frozen pending investigation of irregular transactions. The voice on the other end was apologetic in the way that apologies from institutions always were, expressing regret without accepting responsibility. What irregular transactions? I'm not authorized to provide specifics. You'll need to speak with our fraud department. Transfer me. They're not available until Monday. It was Wednesday. Marcus hung up and drove to the bank. The branch manager was younger than Marcus expected, maybe 35, wearing a suit that fit well and a smile that fit poorly. His desk placard read Jeffrey Brennan, which meant nothing until Marcus remembered that Sheriff Kate Brennan had a younger brother who worked in finance. Mr. Webb, I understand there's a concern about your account. Concern is generous. Frozen is accurate. Jeffrey's smile held its position with visible effort. Our fraud detection algorithms flagged several large deposits that didn't match your normal pattern. What deposits? I'm not authorized to disclose details during an active investigation. Marcus leaned forward slightly, not aggressive, just present. How do I fight a flag I can't see? The investigation will conclude within 30 business days. If no fraud is found, your account will be restored. 30 business days. 6 weeks. Long enough to miss payments, long enough to damage credit, long enough to make the tax bill impossible to pay. Marcus stood. Rex, who had been waiting near the entrance, fell into step beside him. Jeffrey's voice followed them out. Mr. Webb, it's nothing personal, just procedure. Procedure designed by people who understood that financial pressure could break individuals more efficiently than physical threats. The VA benefits delay was discovered when Marcus checked his online account that evening. Disability compensation that deposited automatically on the first of each month was marked as pending review. No explanation, no timeline, no point of contact. He called the regional office, voicemail, called the national hotline, 47-minute hold time. When a human finally answered, they had no access to his file and could only suggest submitting a formal inquiry through the website. Marcus submitted the inquiry, knowing it would disappear into systems designed to process volume rather than resolve issues. The diner refused to serve him the next morning. Marcus walked in at 6:47, same time he visited twice a week, same corner booth Rex had learned to settle under without requiring instruction. The waitress he'd been seeing for 3 years would not make eye contact. Karen was 51, weathered in the way that decades of service work weathered people, kind in the way that kindness became radical in environments that rewarded efficiency over compassion. I can't seat you. Marcus stopped mid-step, processing words that made no sense in sequence. Why? Manager said. Her eyes flickered toward the back office where light showed beneath a closed door. You're trying to kill jobs. Town can't support people who work against its interests. I'm trying to keep contaminated land from poisoning the water table. Karen's expression suggested she had heard arguments before and found all of them insufficient when measured against job security. That's not how people see it. Marcus left without escalation. Rex followed, confused by the deviation from routine, looking back at the diner as if expecting someone to correct the obvious mistake. Hank's shop lost its contracts that same week. 3 construction companies that had used his services for years suddenly found other mechanics. The calls were brief, apologetic, final. Hank told Marcus about it over coffee in the workshop, hands wrapped around a mug that was cooling faster than the space heater could compensate for. They didn't say it was because of you, but they didn't have to. Everyone knows we're friends. Association is enough. Ruth received her eviction notice 2 days later. Building condemned for code violations that had existed for 30 years but were suddenly urgent. She had 60 days to vacate. The notice was signed by a county inspector Marcus didn't recognize, delivered by a process server who apologized while handing over documents that would make a 76-year-old woman homeless. Marcus stood in Ruth's kitchen while she read the paperwork, watching color drain from her face, watching hands that had baked bread for neighbors shake with rage or fear or both. I've lived here 43 years. Since Peter died, they can't just... But they could. The paperwork was legal. The violations were documented. The timeline was established. Fighting would require lawyers she couldn't afford and time she didn't have. You can stay at the outpost. Ruth looked up, eyes wet but not crying, dignity holding even when structure crumbled. I won't let you sacrifice more for me. I'm not sacrificing. I'm offering shelter to someone who needs it, like you've done for half this town. The physical threats began in darkness because threats always did. Marcus's truck lost 2 tires overnight, slashed with precision that suggested experience rather than vandalism. The cuts were clean, placed to cause immediate failure rather than slow leak. The message was clear. We can reach you whenever we want. His cabin windows broke 3 nights later, rocks thrown from tree line at 0314 when sleep was deepest and response slowest. Rex alerted before glass shattered, barking with urgency that pulled Marcus from nightmare into crisis. By the time Marcus reached the porch with flashlight and rifle, whoever had thrown the rocks was gone, leaving only footprints that showed boot size 11 and a stride pattern that suggested military training. The food tampering was more subtle. Marcus caught it only because Rex refused his dinner, backing away from the bowl with the kind of certainty that meant trained detection had identified something wrong. Marcus examined the kibble under bright light, found discoloration that might have been nothing or might have been rat poison mixed in carefully enough to avoid immediate notice. He threw the entire bag away and bought new from a supplier 2 towns over, paying cash, telling no one. Thomas Kern left a note under the windshield wiper while Marcus was inside the hardware store comparing prices on motion sensors and trail cameras. The paper was folded once, message printed rather than handwritten, untraceable. I'm trying to keep this civilized, others won't. Marcus photographed it, logged it, filed it in the growing documentation that might matter someday or might just be evidence collected for no one who cared to review. Rachel Voss called on a Wednesday morning, voice tense in ways that professional polish could not quite conceal. "Mr. Webb, I need to speak with you, not as Crane's attorney, as someone who just discovered she's been lied to." They met at a rest stop halfway between Iron Creek and the county seat, neutral territory that offered visibility in all directions. Rachel's sedan was already parked when Marcus arrived, engine running, exhaust creating a cloud that was being shredded by wind that came across open farmland without obstacles to slow it. She stepped out when Marcus pulled in, dressed for office rather than outdoor meeting, coat insufficient for the temperature that had settled at 18 degrees. Her breath clouded continuously as she spoke, words visible before they were audible. "I researched your claims, expected to disprove them, found the opposite." She handed him a folder, pages organized with tabs and highlights, the kind of preparation that suggested she had been working through the night. "Aldrich's military records confirm intelligence assignment at Fort McCoy. The training accident report from 1968 lists 3 casualties, but the details don't match standard protocols. Wrong terrain for the exercise type, wrong weapons for the wounds described. I pulled medical examiner notes through FOIA request. Ballistics were inconsistent with friendly fire scenario." Marcus scanned the documents, recognizing the names. Whitmore, Hayes, Calloway. "You're telling me what I already know. I'm telling you that you're right. And I'm telling you that my boss's grandfather was CEO of Harlan Chemical Company in 1968. The connection landed with weight that shifted context. Rachel watched Marcus process it, her expression carrying something between guilt and vindication. "I confronted Crane yesterday, asked if he knew about the dumping before purchasing the land. What did he say?" Rachel's laugh was bitter, empty of humor. "He said yes. Said the contamination was minimal after 50 years. Said disclosure would kill the project in the 150 jobs it would create. Said sometimes we make hard choices for the greater good. And you said?" "I quit." She gestured at the folder. "I also took copies of everything. Survey data showing contamination at 43 times safe levels. Internal memos discussing acceptable risk thresholds. Payment records to county officials for expedited permits. Evidence that the land purchase was specifically motivated by need to control the contamination site before anyone discovered it." Marcus closed the folder, processing implications. "Why give this to me? Because I became a lawyer to serve justice, not bury it. And because those were soldiers, like my father was. Like men I grew up respecting. If Crane can cover up their murders for profit, what does that say about whether their service mattered?" The question was rhetorical but landed anyway. Rachel shivered, cold finally penetrating whatever adrenaline had sustained her through the confrontation and theft. "There's an EPA field agent named Sandra Martinez. She's based in Detroit, handles contamination sites across the state. I sent her the survey data anonymously yesterday. She'll be in Iron Creek within a week to conduct preliminary assessment. And when Crane finds out, then we better have documentation he can't destroy and witnesses he can't intimidate." Marcus studied her, recalibrating assessment. 24 hours ago, she had been adversary. Now she was ally, motivated by conscience that had apparently survived law school and corporate practice. "What do you need?" "Help building an airtight case. Every soil sample, every medical record of people who died from lung cancer near the water. Frank Dumont's testimony if he stays lucid long enough to give it. Proof that can't be dismissed as vendetta or conspiracy theory." The alliance formed in that parking lot, sealed not by contract, but by shared understanding that some fights were worth the point even when victory seemed unlikely. Rachel drove away first, leaving Marcus alone with Rex and a folder full of evidence that was either salvation or death sentence, depending on variables neither could control. Margaret Hayes agreed to file the federal whistleblower complaint, her expression suggesting she knew the risk but was calculating it acceptable against the potential reward of actually achieving something meaningful before retirement. They met in her office, documents spread across a conference table that had hosted decades of estate planning and contract negotiation, but probably never anything this dangerous. "If we file this, there's no going back. Crane will fight with everything he has, which is considerable." "I know. You'll be painted as unstable veteran with grudge. They'll dig into your service record, your medical history, your personal life. Anything that can be weaponized will be." Marcus thought about the PTSD diagnosis sitting in his VA file, the failed marriage, the incident in 2019 where he had pulled a weapon on someone who had slammed a car door too loudly behind him. All of it would be public. All of it would be used. "File it." Margaret's pen moved across signature lines with the finality of someone who had made similar decisions before and knew they were measured in years rather than days. Sheriff Kate Brennan appeared at the outpost 3 days later, patrol vehicle parked deliberately in the circular drive rather than attempting to hide her visit. She knocked with official authority, stance carrying weight of badge, and responsibility rather than personal agenda. Marcus opened the door with Rex at his side, both of them reading her body language, finding concern rather than hostility. I need to talk to you, officially and off the record simultaneously, which I recognize as contradiction, but accurately describes the situation. She stepped inside without waiting for invitation, moving with the controlled efficiency of someone who had learned that hesitation invited questioning. Her uniform was winter weight, insulated against cold that made patrol work survivable rather than endurable. I've been documenting harassment complaints, tire slashing, window breaking, food tampering, the bank freeze, tax reassessment, VA benefits delay. Pattern is clear. Coordination is obvious. You here to tell me to drop it? Kate's expression hardened into something that looked like offense tempered by understanding. I'm here to tell you I can't protect you through official channels. My bosses take calls from Crane. Judge signs warrants based on his recommendations. If I file reports that implicate people with influence, those reports will be lost in processing. So I'm on my own. No, you're on record. I'm keeping duplicate files at home, time-stamped, photographed. If something happens to you, there will be evidence that can't be buried bureaucratically. She pulled a small recording device from her jacket pocket, placed it on the table between them. This is illegal without consent. I'm giving you consent. If anyone threatens you, record it. I'll testify to chain of custody even if it costs my career. Marcus looked at the recorder, understanding what the offer meant. Kate was betting her pension on the possibility that justice mattered more than job security. Why? Because 8 years ago, my daughter Emma was born premature. Spent 2 months in NICU fighting for every breath. Doctors couldn't explain why. Just bad luck, they said. Environmental factors. Maybe. Her jaw tightened. I drink the same well water as everyone else. If that water's poisoned, if chemicals from 50 years ago are still leaching into aquifers, then bad luck isn't random. It's consequence of choices people made when they thought consequences wouldn't reach them. She stood. Official business concluded. Personal statement delivered. EPA agent arrives Monday. Be ready. This gets real once federal government is involved. The call came at 01:42 on Saturday morning, jolting Marcus from sleep that had been shallow and fragmented. Rex was already alert, positioned at the bedroom door, ears forward despite mechanical assistance, telling him sound had preceded movement. Kate's voice was tight, professionally controlled, but carrying current of something deeper. Marcus, Emma's missing. She was playing near the creek after school, didn't come home. We've been searching for 6 hours. Temperature had dropped to -8. Wind chill pushed it to -23. Exposure time to hypothermia at that temperature. 20 minutes for a child. Survival time, measured in hours rather than certainty. Where are you? Old Creek Road, South Access Point. Search and rescue is here, but we've lost the scent trail at the water. Marcus was moving before conscious thought completed its cycle. Pulling on layers, grabbing gear that was kept ready because readiness was the only thing that separated good intentions from functional response. Rex was already at the door, harness secured through muscle memory, body language screaming readiness. The drive took 14 minutes. Truck engine protesting cold that had thickened oil to near solid, transmission grinding through gears that resisted engagement. Other vehicles clustered at the access point, lights creating overlapping pools of illumination that made shadows deeper by contrast. Search teams moved in organized patterns, flashlights cutting through darkness, voices calling a name that wine shredded before it could travel far. Kate stood near the command vehicle, face drawn, eyes carrying weight of every parent's worst nightmare made manifest. She turned when Marcus approached, relief and desperation mixing visibly. She's been gone 8 hours. Temperature's killing us. Dogs lost the trail at Creek Crossing. 2 search dogs worked the area. German shepherds with official SAR vests. Handlers guiding them through protocols that were failing because water destroys scent and cold makes tracking unreliable. The dogs were confused, circling, unable to lock onto trail that Creek had washed away. Marcus knelt beside Rex, fingers finding the hearing device, ensuring it was functioning optimally. The dog's amber eyes met his, communication passing between them in frequencies that transcended speech. "Can you find her?" Rex's body shifted, tension coiling into focus. This was what he had been trained for before injury had reclassified him from operational asset to retired liability. This was purpose. One of the SAR handlers saw Marcus preparing Rex and approached, skepticism evident in posture and expression. "He's deaf. He can't follow vocal commands. He won't be effective in coordination." Marcus ignored him, trusting years of partnership over professional opinion. He unclipped Rex's leash, giving the dog freedom to work without mechanical constraint. "Find." The word was unnecessary. Rex was already moving, nose low, sweeping across ground that other dogs had dismissed as empty. But Rex was not tracking scent through air. He was reading the earth itself, feeling vibrations that feet left in frozen soil, detecting compression patterns that indicated weight and direction. The injured leg meant nothing in snow. The damaged hearing meant nothing when the search relied on senses that still functioned at full capacity. Rex moved with the methodical precision of a professional solving a problem through systematic application of skill. He passed the creek without pausing, dismissing water as irrelevant to his current tasking. The other dogs had stopped there because scent disappeared. Rex continued because he was not following scent. He was following physics. Marcus stayed 15 feet behind, close enough to observe, far enough to avoid interfering. Kate and 3 volunteers followed, silent now, watching the deaf dog do what trained searchers could not. Rex angled northeast, away from the creek, into forest that was dense enough to block wind and make temperature fractionally more survivable. His pace quickened, body language shifting from methodical search to targeted pursuit. He had found something. The old mining tunnel was unmarked, hidden beneath deadfall and 50 years of forest reclamation. Only local knowledge would identify it, and local knowledge had forgotten it existed. The entrance was a dark mouth and hillside, maybe 4 feet high, partially collapsed, invisible until you were nearly on top of it. Rex stopped at the entrance, assuming the rigid posture that meant positive detection. Alert, find, success. Marcus pulled his flashlight, angling beam into darkness that swallowed light without returning it. 12 feet in, the tunnel widened. Deeper, a small shape huddled against stone, unmoving. "Emma!" Kate pushed past, maternal instinct overriding protocol. Marcus grabbed her arm, stopping forward momentum with gentle but absolute force. "Wait, structure's unstable. One person, light footprint." He moved forward carefully, testing each footfall, watching for signs of imminent collapse. The tunnel smelled of earth and cold and something else. The particular scent of places where air does not circulate and time moves differently. Emma Brennan was 8 years old, small for her age, wearing a coat that was meant for playing rather than surviving. She was unconscious, skin pale, breathing shallow. Hypothermia, stage 2, possibly stage 3. Core temperature below 90 degrees. Dangerous, potentially fatal. Marcus lifted her with care that came from training that had included civilian casualty protocols, supporting neck and spine, minimizing movement that could trigger cardiac arrest in hypothermic patients. She was lighter than expected, body temperature low enough that holding her felt like carrying something that was already gone. Rex moved ahead, leading them back toward tunnel entrance, toward light and noise and people who were shouting now because they had seen Marcus emerge carrying a child. Kate's training held long enough to assess rather than simply grab. She checked pulse, breathing, pupil response, then wrapped Emma in thermal blankets that had been standing ready for exactly this purpose. "She's alive, barely. We need hospital, now." The ambulance took Emma, sirens cutting through winter night, lights creating urgency that speed translated into miles per hour. Kate rode with her daughter, hand gripping small fingers, willing warmth to transfer through contact and determination. The crowd that remained looked at Rex with expressions that had shifted from skepticism to something approaching awe. The deaf dog, the damaged veteran's broken partner, had just done what trained professionals could not. Marcus knelt beside Rex, running hands along the dog's frame, checking for injury, finding none, feeling instead the solid warmth of muscle that had just performed exactly as designed despite modification and limitation. "Good boy." Rex's tail moved once, acknowledgement accepted, praise appreciated but not required. He had done his job. That was enough. The drive back to the outpost happened in silence. Rex sleeping in the passenger seat, exhaustion claiming a dog who had given everything to the search and now needed to recover before the next tasking. Marcus drove with hands that were steady despite adrenaline crash, mind processing what the rescue meant beyond one child saved. The town had seen. The community that had turned against him, refused him service, vandalized his property and poisoned his dog's food, had witnessed Rex prove that brokenness was not the same as uselessness. That adaptation was its own form of strength. Emma survived. The hospital released her after 36 hours, core temperature restored, no permanent damage, only the kind of story that would be told at family gatherings for generations. Kate brought her to the outpost 4 days later, the girl walking under her own power, shy but determined. She carried flowers, not expensive arrangement from florist, but wildflowers that had been picked from someone's winter garden, kept alive through greenhouse care, offered with the solemnity of someone who understood that gestures mattered more than grandeur. Thank you. Her voice was small but clear, looking at Rex rather than Marcus because children understood instinctively that the dog had been the one who found her. Rex accepted the attention with the calm dignity of working dog who had completed mission successfully and required no external validation. But his tail moved, slight wag that suggested appreciation for recognition, even if recognition was unnecessary. Kate's eyes were wet, contained through professional discipline, but present beneath surface. I'm sorry for everything, for doubting you, for not doing more sooner, for letting them pressure you when you were trying to help. Marcus shook his head, rejecting apology that came from position of powerlessness rather than malice. What do you need? Time and witnesses. EPA agent arrives tomorrow. If she confirms contamination, we have legal basis for emergency action. But until then, we're vulnerable. Crane knows federal investigation is coming. He'll try to sanitize the site. How? However he can, moving evidence, destroying records. If those barrels disappear before EPA tests them, we have nothing but accusations and soil samples that could have come from anywhere. Marcus understood immediately. The barrels were liability while they remained buried and accessible. Once removed, they became deniable. Crane had 48 hours to make them vanish. That night, Marcus set up motion sensors around the Aldrich property, particularly concentrating coverage on the eastern sector where the first burial site had been mapped. Trail cameras positioned to capture approaches from multiple angles. If anyone attempted to excavate, there would be documentation. He slept in the workshop, heater running, rifle leaning against the wall where it could be reached without standing. Rex settled near the door, position chosen to maximize early warning while maintaining rest that body required after the search effort. The alert came at 0237. Motion sensors triggered in sequence, pattern suggesting vehicles approaching on the old logging road that was barely road anymore. Marcus was awake instantly, habits from combat zones overriding the comfort of sleep. Through the window, lights were visible through trees, multiple vehicles, heavy equipment, the distinctive silhouette of an excavator, boom extended, moving toward the eastern sector with purpose that suggested planning and urgency. Marcus grabbed his phone, called Kate. They're here, digging up the site. I'm 30 minutes out. Don't engage. But 30 minutes was enough time to remove evidence, load it, transport it beyond jurisdiction or recovery. Marcus pulled on boots, grabbed the camera, moved toward the door. Rex was already there, ears forward, body language reading, situation and finding it worthy of attention. We're not fighting, just documenting. The dog's tail remained still, acknowledging orders without necessarily agreeing with them. They moved through trees, staying within cover, approaching burial site from angle that offered visibility without exposure. 5 vehicles were arrayed in rough semicircle, lights illuminating work area with intensity that turned night into harsh daylight. The excavator was already digging, bucket cutting through frozen earth with the grinding screech of metal against soil and rock. 2 workers directed the operation, wearing reflective vests, moving with practiced efficiency. This was not improvised. This was planned, rehearsed, executed with professional competence. And standing at the edge of the light, watching the operation with expression that mixed determination and something that might have been regret, was David Crane. Marcus raised the camera, zoomed to maximum, began photographing. Digital images time-stamped, GPS tagged, creating record that could not be easily dismissed. The excavator bucket hit something solid, metallic clang that carried across cold air. The operator adjusted, working more carefully now, clearing soil to reveal the curve of a barrel. military surplus, marking barely visible beneath decades of rust and dirt. One of the workers leaned in, called something to Crane. The response was gesture rather than words, hand movement that meant continue, remove, dispose. The excavator lifted the barrel clear, placed it on flatbed truck bed, then returned to the hole, seeking the next. Marcus photographed it all. The barrel, the workers, Crane's face as light caught it, the vehicle license plates. Every detail that might matter when questions were asked and answers were required. Movement to his left. Marcus turned, found Thomas Kern standing 10 feet away, having approached with the silence of someone whose training included stealth. The security contractor's expression carried conflict, duty warring with conscience in real time. You need to leave. Not until EPA arrives. Marcus, first time Kern had used his given name. If you're here when they see you, this becomes obstruction. They'll arrest you. Testimony becomes inadmissible. Everything you're trying to prove gets dismissed. Then they'll have to explain why they're digging up barrels in the middle of the night. Kern glanced back at the excavation, at Crane directing workers with gestures that suggested urgency bordering on panic. He's scared. Scared people make mistakes. Don't be one of them. The excavator hit another barrel, and another. The work accelerated, efficiency improving as workers found rhythm. But the fourth barrel did not lift cleanly. The corroded metal, weakened by 57 years underground, split when the bucket applied pressure. Chemical smell hit the air instantly, sharp enough to make eyes water, distinct enough to be identifiable even without training. Agent Orange-based compounds, defoliant residue, poison that had been designed to kill vegetation and had proven quite effective at killing people too. Workers jumped back, covering faces with hands that were not equipped with proper protection. The excavator operator killed the engine, abandoning the cab, putting distance between himself and whatever was now leaching into night air. Crane was shouting, words lost in the sudden chaos of people who realized they had just exposed themselves to toxins that cause cancer and birth defects and every variety of suffering that chemicals could inflict on human biology. Marcus photographed it. The split barrel, the workers fleeing, the liquid pooling in excavated soil. The moment when crime became undeniable. Sirens cut through the night, Kate arriving with backup, lights creating new illumination that turned the site from covert operation to crime scene. Behind her, a second vehicle bearing EPA markings and federal authority that superseded local jurisdiction. Sandra Martinez emerged, 53 years old, built solid, carrying herself with the authority of someone who had shut down illegal dumping operations across 3 states and was not impressed by corporate executives who thought influence extended beyond county lines. Federal crime scene, everyone freeze. Crane's expression cycled through calculation, rage, resignation. He stood in the center of it all, the leaking barrel at his feet, chemicals poisoning ground that his family had poisoned twice now. Legacy written in toxicity that would outlast memory. Kern had disappeared into trees, melting away with the practiced skill of someone who knew when extraction was the only viable option. The arrests happened efficiently. Crane for evidence tampering, environmental crimes, obstruction of federal investigation. The workers for unlawful disposal, operating without proper permits, exposure violations. The charges would multiply as lawyers got involved, but the foundation was established here in frozen earth and split metal. Kate approached Marcus as dawn began its slow infiltration, light revealing the scope of contamination that darkness had hidden. Her expression carried exhaustion and vindication in equal measure. "We got him!" Marcus looked at the barrel, at the soil sample he had collected weeks ago, at the map Aldrich had drawn with shaking hands 55 years into a promise he could not keep alone. For now, because legal victory was not the same as social victory, the town still blamed him, jobs were still lost, and Emma Brennan's flowers still sat on the outpost porch, wilting and cold that would kill them before spring arrived to offer renewal. Rex pressed against Marcus's leg, solid and warm and present. The dog had proven his worth, had adapted to limitation and found strength in adaptation. But proof did not erase the years of being dismissed as broken. Marcus scratched behind the dog's remaining good ear, feeling the hearing device pulse its steady confirmation. "We did good, didn't we?" Rex's tail moved once. Agreement or acknowledgement, the distinction irrelevant. The sun continued rising, indifferent to human drama, illuminating a landscape that would take decades to clean and generations to forget. The federal charges took 4 days to formalize, processed through systems designed to ensure that justice moved with deliberation rather than haste. David Crane spent those days in county lockup, bail set at $2 million, surety unavailable because banks understood that contaminated land made poor collateral. His lawyers filed motions that were denied with the efficiency of legal proceedings where evidence was photographic and chemical analysis was irrefutable. Marcus watched it unfold from distance that felt appropriate for someone whose involvement, had been catalyst rather than participant. The EPA cordoned off the burial site, technicians in hazmat suits excavating with precision that made Crane's midnight operation look like what it had been. Desperation disguised as planning. 53 barrels total, matching Frank's count from 1968, each one tagged and logged and transported to facilities designed to handle materials that remain toxic decades after manufacture. The news coverage was regional at first, then national when reporters discovered the military angle. 3 soldiers murdered for trying to report environmental crime. Cover-up lasting 57 years. Veteran exposing truth after inheriting property from intelligence officer who had spent lifetime collecting proof. The narrative had everything that made stories travel: injustice, redemption, conspiracy proven real. Marcus declined every interview request. The story was not his to tell. It belonged to Peter Calloway and Samuel Hayes and James Whitmore, and the dead did not give interviews. The legal resolution came faster than anyone anticipated. Crane pled guilty to evidence tampering, environmental violations, obstruction of federal investigation. His lawyers negotiated 5 years in federal prison, forfeiture of assets, permanent ban from development work. The sentence was announced on a Thursday morning in a courtroom that held maybe 30 spectators, most of them reporters looking for quotes that Marcus did not provide. Rachel Voss testified, immunity granted in exchange for cooperation that included turning over files documenting 3 years of knowing misconduct. She was disbarred by Friday afternoon, license revoked through proceedings that were perfunctory because no one defended attorneys who betrayed client privilege even when clients deserved betrayal. She started work the following Monday at a legal aid clinic in Detroit. Salary 1/3 of what Crane had paid, satisfaction apparently worth the difference. Thomas Kern received immunity for testimony that corroborated everything Rachel's documents proved. He used his savings to pay for his daughter's next round of treatment, then sold his house to cover the round after that. Medical debt did not care about redemption arcs or moral complexity. The EPA declared the site a Superfund cleanup zone. Timeline for remediation, 10 years minimum. Cost estimate, $40 million, funded through federal environmental programs and whatever could be recovered from Crane's dissolved company. The land would be monitored for decades, tested annually, restricted from development until chemical levels dropped below thresholds that were still being debated by people who measured safety in parts per billion. Marcus stood at the property line on the morning the EPA installed permanent monitoring wells, watching workers in protective equipment drill holes that would measure groundwater contamination for years after everyone involved was dead. The wind was still cold despite calendar suggestions that spring was approaching. March in northern Michigan meant winter was considering departure without committing to actual leaving. Rex sat beside him, positioned where his shoulder touched Marcus's leg, connection maintained through contact that required no words. The dog was calmer now, sleeping through nights without startling, eating without suspicion, moving through the world with confidence that came from proving adaptation was its own form of competence. The hollow feeling arrived 3 days after the sentencing, settling into Marcus's chest with the weight of something that had been delayed rather than avoided. He stood in the outpost main room, looking at furniture that had been Aldrich's, wondering what victory was supposed to feel like when it arrived accompanied by loss. The diner still would not serve him. The hardware store had started accepting his business again, but conversations were brief, transactional, empty of the casual familiarity that built community. Ruth had moved into the outpost as planned, occupying the east bedroom, cooking meals that Marcus ate without tasting, offering companionship that felt like obligation wearing kindness as disguise. Hank's shop had regained 2 of its lost contracts, the others going to competitors who had been smart enough to maintain distance from controversy. Frank remained in the care facility, lucidity coming and going like weather, testimonial value expended. Relevance returned to the category of old men whose memories were convenient when needed, and dismissible when not. The town held a meeting 2 weeks after Crane's sentencing, not official government proceeding, but gathering organized by people who had opinions about what had happened and wanted those opinions heard by someone. Marcus attended because avoiding it felt like cowardice, and cowardice was one of the few things he could not tolerate in himself, even when circumstance suggested it might be the wisest choice. The community center held maybe 150 people, which for Iron Creek represented significant turnout. The building smelled like the 1970s, acoustic tile ceiling yellowed by decades of insufficient ventilation, fluorescent lights casting the particular harshness that made everyone look sick or angry or both. Metal folding chairs arranged in rows that were mostly full, suggesting the topic mattered enough to interrupt evening routines. Mayor Weatherly opened with the tone of someone who had practiced neutrality without achieving it. We're here to discuss the future of economic development following recent legal proceedings. Translation: Marcus had destroyed jobs, and now the town needed to decide what to do about the man who had prioritized contamination over employment. Marcus sat in the back row, Rex at his feet, both of them cataloging exits and observing crowd dynamics with habits that had been formed in environments where crowds could transition from peaceful to violent with minimal warning. The faces that turned to look at him carried expressions ranging from resentment to gratitude, with resentment holding clear majority. A man Marcus recognized as superintendent of the school district stood first. Crane Development was going to employ 150 people. Construction phase alone was 2 years of steady work. Now we have nothing. Unemployment is 12%. Young people are leaving because there's no reason to stay. How is that better than accepting some environmental risk? The question landed with weight that suggested it had been discussed in homes and shops and bars, refined through repetition until it had achieved status of common sense. A woman near the front, wearing a jacket that identified her as belonging to the County Planning Commission, added her voice to the calculation. The tax revenue from that development would have funded schools, roads, emergency services. Instead, we have a Superfund site that makes the whole area look toxic. Who's going to invest here now? Who's going to move here? We're poison territory. Margaret Hayes stood, her presence commanding attention through decades of experience in rooms where voices competed for dominance. The alternative was building luxury condos on land contaminated with chemicals that cause cancer. The water table contamination would have reached town wells within 5 years. You would have had another Flint, Michigan, dead children, lawsuits, bankruptcy, but at least you would have had jobs first. The sarcasm landed with precision that made people flinch, but it did not change minds. Fear of future harm rarely outweighed immediate economic pain. Marcus listened to the arguments cycle through variations on the same theme: jobs versus health, economic development versus environmental protection, practical needs versus abstract principles. The debate was not new. It had been happening since the first person decided that profit justified risk, and the second person decided that some risks were not worth any profit. He stood when the arguments had exhausted themselves into repetition. Chairs scraped, conversations quieted. Everyone turned to look at the man who had killed their jobs to save their aquifer. I know you blame me. You're not wrong. 150 jobs are gone because I refuse to stay quiet. The silence that followed held weight of acknowledgement without forgiveness. But here's what I'm offering. The outpost becomes a veteran resource center, job training and marketable skills, mechanical work with Hank, construction, outdoor skills, partnerships with the VA for mental health resources, emergency shelter during economic hardship. It won't employ 150 people, but it'll employ 30, permanently, doing work that actually helps rather than building on poison ground. A councilman Marcus did not recognize leaned forward, skepticism evident in every line of his posture. We needed luxury condos and a marina. You're offering charity for broken soldiers. I'm offering skills training and stable employment. There's a difference, not to people who need jobs now. Marcus felt the argument slipping away, felt the room's sentiment hardening against solutions that did not restore what had been lost. He was preparing to sit down, accept defeat, leave them to their resentment when a small voice cut through the adult conversation. Rex saved my life. Emma Brennan stood in the third row, 8 years old, wearing a jacket that was too large and holding her mother's hand with the grip of someone who still remembered what being lost felt like. Her voice was thin but clear, carrying in the way children's voices carried when adults had forgotten to listen. Mr. Webb's dog found me when I was gonna die. The other dogs couldn't, but Rex did, and Mr. Webb didn't ask for anything. He just helped. Kate's face was tight with the effort of maintaining professional composure while her daughter spoke truth that adults had been dancing around. Emma continued with the logic that only children could deploy effectively. Why are we mean to people who help? The question hung in the space where complex arguments had been failing. Simple enough that refusal required explanations no one wanted to provide. An 8-year-old had just distilled moral calculation into 6 words, and the room had no adequate response. The vote happened 30 minutes later, after more debate that felt obligatory rather than productive. 60% approved the proposal. Not unanimous, not overwhelming, but enough. Marcus left before the meeting officially adjourned, stepping into night air that had dropped to 23 degrees, cold enough to be uncomfortable without being dangerous. Rex followed at heel, both of them moving toward the truck with synchronized steps that came from partnership rather than training. Ruth was waiting at the outpost when they arrived, sitting in the main room with a book open on her lap, reading glasses perched on her nose. She looked up when the door opened, expression holding question that she did not voice. 60%. Ruth closed the book carefully, marking her place with a receipt that had been folded to serve as bookmark. That's more than I expected. Marcus shrugged out of his jacket, hanging it on the hook that had been Aldrich's, wondering when wearing dead men's spaces became comfortable instead of invasive. Doesn't feel like victory, because righteousness doesn't pay rent. Ruth's voice carried the particular weariness of someone who had lived long enough to see principle cost more than compromise. Ben spent 55 years fighting this. It cost him everything. His marriage ended because his wife couldn't stand living with someone obsessed with dead soldiers. His daughter stopped speaking to him because he chose the covenant over her college fund. He died alone in a house full of evidence that only mattered after he was gone. She stood, moving with the careful precision of joints that required negotiation rather than obedience. Was it worth it? I don't know. Ask me when I'm dead too. Marcus watched her climb the stairs to the bedroom that used to be guest space and was now permanent residence. Each step deliberate, age making itself known through motion that required thought. He sat in the chair that was beginning to feel like his, Rex settling at his feet in the space that was becoming theirs. The outpost was quiet in the way that buildings were quiet when people slept inside them. Presence implied through absence of emptiness. Marcus pulled Aldrich's journal from the shelf where it had been placed after evidence, photographs were completed, and legal proceedings no longer required original documents. The pages were yellowed, brittle at the edges, filled with handwriting that had remained consistent across decades despite whatever turmoil had surrounded its creation. The entries were methodical. Dates, locations, conversations remembered and recorded with precision that suggested documentation mattered more than catharsis. Marcus had read portions during the investigation, enough to understand timeline and establish proof. But he had not read the final entries, the pages where Aldrich's hand had become unsteady and words had bled together. The last entry was dated 6 days before Aldrich's death. March 17th, 2024. I'm 78 years old. I've spent 55 years trying to keep a promise to 3 dead soldiers. I've collected soil samples that prove contamination. I've documented cancer deaths that match exposure patterns. I've traced Crane's family connection to Harlan Chemical Company. I have everything except the courage to keep going. Today I walk to the creek. The ice is melting. It would be easy to step through, let cold water do what age will do anyway, but slower. Quick versus prolonged. The math seemed favorable. Then someone pulled me out. Former Army, EOD. By the way, he moved. Didn't ask questions, just got me to shore and called for help. His name was Marcus Webb. While I was lying there shivering, he said something. You're not done yet. I asked how he knew. He said, because you're still breathing. Stupid logic, true anyway. I spent 6 more years gathering proof. Now I'm dying. Heart is fine, but something is wrong. Medications taste different. Vision blurs at odd times. I think someone knows what I'm collecting and has decided that natural causes can be accelerated. If Webb finds this, he'll understand. The covenant was never about exposing the crime. It was about ensuring no one else suffers what Whitmore, Hayes, and Calloway suffered. Standing up when everyone else sits down. Keeping promises to dead men even when the living try to bury them a second time. The silver dollar belonged to Peter. Ruth gave it to him. He gave it to me the night before he died. Said if something happened, I should return it. Tell her he loved her, that he tried to do the right thing. I kept it 55 years. Couldn't return it. Couldn't admit I'd failed to keep the larger promise. Now Webb carries it. Better man than I was. Maybe he'll finish what I started. Or maybe he'll be smart enough to walk away. Both choices have merit. Both require courage. Marcus closed the journal, placing it back on the shelf with care that objects of historical weight deserved. He pulled the silver dollar from his pocket, turning it under lamplight, watching how metal caught illumination and held it. The engraving was still visible despite wear. Covenant, one word carrying 57 years of meaning that had evolved beyond original intent. He climbed the stairs to Ruth's room, knocked softly. Her voice came through door that was ajar. Come in. Ruth sat in the chair near the window, book closed now, hands folded in her lap. She looked smaller at night, as if darkness reduced physical presence to match dwindled expectations. Marcus held out the coin. This was Peter's. Ruth's expression cycled through recognition, pain, something that might have been relief. Her hand trembled as she took it, fingers running over the engraved word with the familiarity of someone who had touched it before. I gave this to him before he deployed. Silver dollar from the year we met. Thought it would keep him safe. Her laugh was bitter, empty. Didn't work. He came home. Then he died anyway, trying to report something that should have mattered but didn't. It matters now. 57 years later, he's been dead longer than he was alive. What good is justice that takes generations to arrive? Marcus had no answer that would satisfy the question. Justice delayed was justice denied, and denial lasting 57 years was indistinguishable from absence. Ruth handed the coin back. Ben kept this because he couldn't face me. Couldn't admit he'd failed to keep his promise. Now you have it. What are you going to do? Marcus looked at the silver dollar, at the single word that had been meant to represent honor and loyalty and commitment. Covenant, promise between parties. Obligation that transcended circumstance. Keep it alive. Make sure the next soldier who needs help gets it. Ruth studied him with eyes that had seen enough broken promises to recognize when one might actually be kept. That's what Ben wanted. Not revenge, not justice, just continuation. Someone standing when everyone else sits down. The understanding settled with the weight of inheritance accepted rather than imposed. The covenant had never been about the barrels or the land or even the 3 dead soldiers. It had been about creating space where honor mattered more than convenience, where duty outlasted profit, where promises made to the forgotten were kept by people who remembered. Marcus descended the stairs, silver dollar returned to his pocket, mind already calculating what converting the outpost into functional veteran center would require. Not just money, though money would be necessary, but vision, purpose, the kind of commitment that measured success and changed lives rather than quarterly returns. The transformation took 6 months, funded through combination of sources that Margaret assembled with the efficiency of someone who understood that nonprofit work required creativity rather than capital. VA grants for veteran services, state funding for job training programs, private donations from people who believed in redemption narratives enough to invest money in their success. The outpost was gutted and rebuilt, structural elements reinforced, electrical updated to code that had been established after the building was constructed, plumbing replaced with materials designed to last decades rather than survive until next repair. The workshop became training facility, equipped with tools that Hank selected based on what skills were marketable rather than what equipment was cheapest. Ruth managed the administrative work, organizing schedules and maintaining records with the precision of someone who had spent 37 years teaching children that systems mattered when chaos was the default state. She converted the library room into office space, filling it with filing cabinets and computers that were donated by businesses looking for tax deductions and goodwill. Hank taught mechanical skills, his voice rough but patient, explaining engine theory to veterans who understood mechanical systems through metaphor and hands-on demonstration rather than textbooks that assumed prior knowledge. His shop became satellite facility, overflow space where larger projects could be completed without disturbing the teaching environment. Margaret handled legal formation, incorporating the center as 501c3 nonprofit, establishing bylaws that prevented future drift from mission, creating governance structure that would outlast any individual's involvement. Her fee was reduced to consulting rate that was half her normal billing, payment deferred until funding stabilized, Interest waived because some work was worth doing regardless of profitability. Sheriff Kate conducted crisis counseling sessions, leveraging her background in military police and current expertise in community mental health. The sessions were voluntary, confidential, structured to provide support without requiring vulnerability that many veterans were not ready to offer. Attendance was sparse initially, growing as word spread that help was available without judgment attached. Thomas Kern joined as security instructor after 3 months, teaching tactical skills to veterans entering law enforcement or private security work. His daughter remained in remission, his house was gone, but employment at the center provided salary that covered medical insurance premiums and rent for apartment that was smaller than the home he had lost, but larger than the guilt he carried. The official opening was scheduled for October 15th, date chosen because it fell between agricultural harvest and winter weather, window when people had time to attend ceremonies without sacrificing economic necessity. The morning arrived with the kind of clarity that northern Michigan specialized in. Sky stretched tight in blue above landscape that was preparing for winter without surrendering to it yet. Temperature at 47 degrees, wind absent, sunlight angling across the property with the particular quality that made every surface seem etched in definition. The sign had been installed 2 days earlier, replacing the weathered board that had announced Aldrich property for decades. New wood professionally carved, letters filled with paint that would last through northern winters without fading. The name had been debated, revised, finalized through consensus that acknowledged multiple histories. Aldrich Callaway Veterans Center, 2 names instead of one, representing intelligence officer who had collected proof and enlisted soldier who had died trying to report it. Neither man had succeeded in their lifetime. Both were honored in death through facility that would serve people they would never meet. The plaque was bronze, mounted beside the entrance, listing 3 names in letters large enough to read from the parking area. Private First Class James Whitmore, Corporal Samuel Hayes, Sergeant Peter Callaway, killed in the line of duty, 1968, while attempting to report environmental crime that endangered civilian population. Their sacrifice made this facility possible. Chairs had been arranged on the front lawn, metal folding seats in rows of 10, 50 total, facing the entrance where Ruth would speak and Marcus would explain and Margaret would handle official proceedings. The chairs were filling by 10:30, people arriving in clusters, some familiar faces from town, others from surrounding counties, veterans who had heard about the center through networks that operated below official channels. Emma Brennan arrived with her mother at 10:45, wearing a dress that was formal without being uncomfortable, carrying herself with the particular solemnity of someone who understood that some ceremonies mattered beyond their immediate entertainment value. She took a seat in the front row, Kate beside her, both of them representing something that Marcus had not expected, forgiveness, or at least the possibility of it. Hank arrived with Frank, the older man, lucid today, eyes clear, posture suggesting he knew where he was and why. They sat together in the third row, 2 men separated by decades but connected through service that had shaped them in ways civilians would never fully understand. Rachel Voss drove in from Detroit, arriving at 10:55, taking a seat near the back despite having contributed legal work that had made the center's nonprofit status possible. She wore simple clothing, professional without being corporate, carrying herself with the particular humility of someone who had been disbarred and was learning to measure success through different metrics. By 1100, 47 chairs were occupied, not capacity, but substantial. Marcus stood near the entrance, watching the gathering, feeling something that approached satisfaction without achieving it fully. This was not triumph, it was continuation. The difference mattered. Ruth emerged from the building at exactly 1100, moving with deliberate steps, positioning herself beside the plaque that bore her husband's name. She wore a simple dress in dark blue, no jewelry except wedding ring that had remained on her finger for 43 years, despite the husband being gone for most of them. Her voice when she spoke was stronger than her frame suggested possible. Thank you for coming. Many of you knew Peter Callaway. Some of you knew Sam Hayes or Jimmy Whitmore. They were young men who tried to do the right thing and died for it. For 57 years, nobody remembered except the families who loved them and the man who spent his life trying to prove their deaths mattered. She placed her hand on the bronze plaque, fingers tracing letters that spelled her husband's name. Ben Aldrich kept a promise when it would have been easier to forget. Marcus Webb honored that promise when it would have been smarter to walk away. Now, this center exists because both men believe that standing up when everyone else sits down is worth whatever it costs. She stepped back, gesture indicating that Marcus should speak. He moved forward, uncomfortable with attention, but understanding that discomfort was irrelevant to necessity. This center offers job training for veterans who need marketable skills, mental health support for people who carried war home and don't know how to put it down, emergency shelter for anyone who falls through gaps that systems always create. We won't save everyone, but we'll be here when someone needs us. That's the promise. That's the covenant. The words were brief, functional, empty of rhetoric that would have made them memorable but false. He stepped back, letting Margaret handle the official dedication that involved legal language and nonprofit status and tax documentation that made good intentions permanent through bureaucratic structure. The ceremony concluded at 11:27. People rose, moving toward the building to tour facilities that had been transformed from abandoned property into functional training center. Marcus remained outside, watching the crowd disperse, feeling Rex press against his leg in the way that meant the dog was reading his uncertainty and offering presence as counterweight. We did it. Rex's tail moved once, acknowledgement without judgment. The reception moved inside, people examining classrooms and training bays and sleeping quarters that would house veterans during transition periods that sometimes lasted weeks and sometimes lasted months, depending on variables no checklist could predict. Coffee had been brewed in industrial quantities. Ruth had organized food contributions from people who had decided that supporting the center was worth setting aside resentment about jobs that would never return. Marcus moved through the space, accepting congratulations that felt premature, answering questions about enrollment and services and whether the center would be sustainable beyond initial funding. The answers were honest. Maybe. Probably. We'll find out. By 1400, the crowd had thinned. Most people had returned to lives that required attention, regardless of ceremonies attended or history acknowledged. Marcus stood in the main room, looking at furniture that was no longer Aldrich's or his, but belonged to the center itself, property held in trust for purpose that transcended individual ownership. Ruth appeared beside him, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent 6 months building systems and was now watching them become operational. You should read this. She handed him an envelope, white paper, standard size, his name written across the front in handwriting that was careful and deliberate. The postmark showed Cincinnati, dated 3 days earlier. Marcus opened it, standing, paper crackling slightly in the quiet room. The letter was single page, typed rather than handwritten, formatted with the precision of someone who worked in a profession that valued clarity over personality. Mr. Webb, my name is James Whitmore, Jr. My father died in 1968 when I was 6 months old. I never knew him except through photographs and stories my mother told before dementia took her ability to remember anything clearly. The Army told us it was training accident. Live fire exercise gone wrong. We received flag and condolences and pension that was calculated to be sufficient compensation for loss that could not be compensated. I believed the story for 56 years. Why wouldn't I? The government had no reason to lie about training accident. Then the EPA published their findings on the Iron Creek contamination case. I read the report because I follow environmental law professionally. I'm an attorney in Cincinnati, specializing in toxic tort litigation. The report mentioned 3 soldiers who died attempting to report illegal chemical dumping in 1968. One of them was PFC James Whitmore. I requested military records through FOIA. Read the incident report. Saw the inconsistencies that nobody had questioned in 1968 because questioning meant challenging authority that was presumed to be honest. My father was murdered for trying to do the right thing. For 56 years, nobody knew except the people who killed him and the man who tried to investigate but was silenced. You gave my father's death meaning. You ensured that his sacrifice was acknowledged rather than buried. You created facility that serves people like him, people who tried to do right and paid for it. I have a son. He's joining the Army next year. Infantry. When he asked what his grandfather was like, I could only tell him, training accident. Now I can tell him the truth, that James Whitmore was brave, that he tried to do the right thing even when it was dangerous, that someone remembered. That matters more than you know. My son will carry his grandfather's name into service, knowing that it means something and that it represents courage rather than misfortune. that standing up is worth the cost even when the cost is everything. Thank you for keeping the covenant, James Whitmore Jr. Marcus read it twice, the second time slower, absorbing details that first reading had blurred through surprise. His hands were steady holding the paper, but something in his chest had shifted, weight redistributing itself in ways that made breathing easier. Ruth was watching him, expression carrying understanding that came from having lived long enough to recognize when letters mattered more than their word count suggested. Peter would have liked that, she said quietly, knowing that someone's son would grow up understanding what his grandfather tried to do. Marcus folded the letter carefully, placing it in his jacket pocket where it would stay until he could file it with other documents that recorded history's slow correction of its own errors. Through the window, he could see people still lingering on the lawn, conversations happening in small clusters, veterans connecting with other veterans through shared language that civilians could approximate but never fully speak. Emma Brennan was talking to one of the instructors, her mother standing nearby, both of them representing something that had seemed impossible weeks ago. Integration, acceptance, the possibility that scars could exist without defining everything. Rex had settled near the doorway, position chosen to observe both interior and exterior. Divided attention that working dogs never fully abandoned, even when rest was appropriate. His amber eyes were calm, no longer scanning for danger that might never arrive, content to simply be present without requiring constant vigilance. Marcus moved to the window, standing where light came through glass that was original to the building, imperfect and wavy, distorting the view in ways that made distances uncertain. The property stretched beyond what he could see, 47 acres that would be monitored for decades, tested annually, cleaned slowly through processes that would outlast everyone currently standing on it. But the land would recover. Soil had remarkable capacity for regeneration when given time and attention, and resources that valued restoration over exploitation. The monitoring wells would track progress. The cleanup crews would remove contamination. Eventually, maybe in his lifetime, but more likely in someone else's, the land would return to condition that allowed growth without poison. The covenant continued, not because it was easy, not because it was profitable, but because some promises were worth keeping even when keeping them cost everything the living possessed. Marcus turned from the window, returning to the work that was never finished but always necessary. Ruth needed help organizing intake paperwork. Hank was waiting for approval on equipment purchases. Margaret required signatures on insurance documents that protected the center from liabilities that were inevitable when working with populations that carried both potential and risk. The afternoon proceeded with the mundane efficiency of operations that had been planned carefully enough to function without constant intervention. People came, questions were answered, forms were completed. The center began its actual work, which was less dramatic than opening ceremonies suggested, but more important than any single event could capture. By 1700, the sun was beginning its early winter retreat, light angling lower, shadows lengthening across lawn that had been walked on by more people today than probably any day in the property's history. Marcus stood on the porch watching the last visitors depart, cars navigating the access road that had been improved during renovation, but still carried washboard sections that made driving uncomfortable at any speed. Rex emerged from inside, moving to his customary position at Marcus's side, shoulder-brushing leg in contact that was both greeting and confirmation. The dog looked out at the property with eyes that no longer carried the uncertainty that had defined him when hearing loss had forced retirement from active service. Rex had proven his worth, had adapted to limitation, and found that adaptation was its own form of mastery. Marcus scratched behind the dog's ear, feeling the hearing device pulse its steady confirmation that the world was being processed, incomplete but functional, damaged but operational. We kept it, didn't we? The promise. Rex's tail moved once, agreement or acknowledgement, the distinction irrelevant when the outcome was the same. The silver dollar rested in Marcus's pocket, weight barely noticeable but present. He pulled it out one final time, turning it in fading light, watching how tarnished metal caught illumination and held it despite decades of handling that had worn smooth what had once been sharp. Covenant, one word, infinite implications, standing when everyone else sits down, keeping promises to dead men, ensuring that sacrifice creates legacy rather than tragedy. Tomorrow the center would open for actual operations. Veterans would arrive seeking help with employment, housing, mental health challenges that had resisted civilian solutions. Some would succeed, some would struggle, some would disappear back into systems that had failed them before and would probably fail them again. But the door would remain open, the lights would stay on, and someone would be there to answer when help was needed. That was the covenant, not perfect salvation, just persistent presence. The willingness to stand when standing was the hardest option available. Marcus returned the coin to his pocket, feeling its weight settle against his leg as he moved back inside. Rex followed, both of them crossing the threshold into warmth that smelled of coffee and fresh paint and the particular optimism that accompanied new beginnings before reality had time to introduce complications. Ruth was organizing paperwork at the desk that had been designated as administrative center. Hank was reviewing tomorrow's training schedule with an intensity that suggested he took teaching as seriously as he had once taken combat. Margaret was on the phone negotiating insurance rates with the particular patience of someone who understood that bureaucracy moved at speeds designed to test commitment rather than facilitate progress. The work continued. The covenant endured. And in Cincinnati, a young man who had never met his grandfather would grow up knowing that James Whitmore had died trying to do the right thing, and that someone had remembered long enough to make that death mean something beyond tragedy. The dead remained dead, the living continued living, and the space between them was bridged by people who remembered that memory was its own form of defiance against time's insistence that everything eventually disappeared into forgetting. Marcus sat at the desk opposite Ruth, opening the first file that required attention, beginning the work that would define the center's actual purpose beyond ceremonies and speeches, forms to complete, schedules to establish, resources to allocate, the mundane machinery of helping that was less inspiring than dramatic rescues, but more sustainable than interventions that required crisis to justify action. Rex settled near the doorway, position chosen through instinct and training, ready to alert if threat approached, content to rest if peace held. His breathing was steady, calm, the rhythm of an animal that had found purpose after years of questioning whether purpose remained possible. Outside, darkness completed its arrival. Northern Michigan winter asserting itself with the inevitability of season that would last months before surrendering to spring that was still distant enough to feel theoretical. But inside, warmth persisted, light continued, and doors remained open to whoever needed what the center offered. The covenant lived, not through grand gestures or heroic sacrifices, but through the quiet decision to show up tomorrow and the day after that and the day after that, regardless of whether recognition arrived or profit materialized or gratitude was expressed. Some promises were kept, not because they were easy, but because walking away was unthinkable for people who had learned that honor was measured in sustained effort rather than momentary courage. Marcus signed the first form, then the second, then the third. The work continued, ordinary and essential, building something that would outlast any individual's involvement through simple refusal to quit when quitting was the logical choice. Rex's tail thumped once against the floor, acknowledging nothing in particular, affirming everything that mattered. The center stood, the door remained open, and the covenant endured.